inception of the Communist Party in Pakistan as a sort of from 1947-48 onwards, which of course the Communist Party of Pakistan was formed out of the Communist Party of India. After partition, even the Communist Party was divided, and cadres came from India, and some were already here to create this group, which initially was overground, which was a legal party, but had a lot of repression from the state. It was only banned in 1954 formally. And then I looked at some of the events of the late 50s and the 60s, culminating in 1971 and 72, 71 being a major moment in Pakistan's history because of the division of the country in 1972 as the first year of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's rule, in which there were major labor strikes and labor struggles in especially Karachi, and then later on in 73 onwards in Punjab as well. So that's what is clear. So it's a kind of a hidden labor history, but trying to trace the history of left and especially the history of the Communist Party, but also its evolution, its fracture, its divisions in the 50s and 60s.
So are you essentially saying that the Communist Party was the only real communist group in Pakistan as the country was formed? Because we see that, you know, there were other political parties also that sort of loosely adhered to communism.
No, but that is much later. I mean, initial period, what we see is that, of course, Muslim League was the largest party in Pakistan in 1947. Of course, within Muslim League itself, there were various factions, and there were some more progressive people like Mia Iftikharuddin, who later on formed the Pakistan Times, Imroz, you know, and others as well. And by the early 50s, the Muslim League had also divided into many groups. There was Jinnah Muslim League, Mamdod Saab Ki, and then, you know, things like that. So what I'm trying to suggest is that initially a lot of the left sort of adhered, if not completely as card-carrying members, but sort of a lot of the people who had progressive ideals sort of worked around the Communist Party, although they may not have. It's only later that these various kinds of more formal groupings came up. Of course, in the late 50s, already what we called Awami League of Maulana Bhashani had started. They were not, they were sort of progressive, but also nationalist. Even Sarwardi was part of that. And later on that and other groups coming together formed in the 1956-57 National Awami Party, which was sort of broadly left of center. So, I mean, on the formal politics, in terms of electoral politics, grouping started happening in the 50s, but as a socialist communist group, Communist Party of Pakistan as a legal entity did exist from 1948 to 1954. I apologize. Yeah, but and then, you know, things also evolved in that because it had to go underground after being banned. And in the 50s and 60s, the coalition was basically the left cadre worked with different more legal and formal parties like National Awami Party.
Yeah. So, so do you think if you look at, you know, the circumstances in which Pakistan was formed, do you think Pakistan, you know, a lot of people say that Pakistan was naturally inclined to a more feudalistic sort of a state structure dominated by feudals? Do you think Pakistan had a natural disposition towards socialism or communism, or was it sort of ill-disposed towards these systems?
Asad Saab, the issue of natural disposition, though, it's a very difficult. Of course, you know, the argument for what the socialists were making, of course, was also based on a certain kind of teleology, a certain kind of reading of history. The idea was that, you know, first you have to have industrialization, then you have to have the proletariat, and then the proletariat have to struggle initially in sort of a bourgeois. So those kinds of stages of history kind of thesis, as we are well aware. I mean, even in the sense that if you look at 1857, Marx writes about 1857, about the horrors of how the British crushed the, what we call the War of Independence, the British call the mutiny. But he said that this had to happen because from the ashes of this will rise a certain kind of a modernization, industrialization, the proletariat, and then hopefully, so it's a very interesting teleology that the Marxist, more sort of traditional, or I would say more sort of the formal Marxist discussion on history has. So I think at that level, saying a country like Pakistan that only got 9% of the industries of United British India did not have a very large formal working class, right? And it was still a much rural economy based on the kinds of structures of power and that you are talking about, feudalism and everything. And also the largest amount of labor concentration was in places like railways or in East Pakistan in the tea gardens, right? So we didn't even have a large industry. I mean, in Karachi, apart from the port workers, there was very few, there was some cement factories, there were some construction concerns. Actually, the Communist Party was most involved there amongst the port workers or the municipal workers or the beedi workers, right? Or the postal workers. So service industry, beedi hoti hai na, the sort of the cigarette workers, things like that. So we didn't have a large of industrial, even in then Lailpur, Faisalabad, there was some textile mill, there was some, khada, there was sort of atak oil. So, but it was a very, so to say that it was ripe for a socialist kind of revolution one can't say according to the older history. Of course, China in 1949 has the revolution, the Maoist revolution, which is not based on industrial workers. So there's a different model that also rises. So now that is one part of it. The other part of it, whether Pakistan was ripe or not, one has to say that what kind of leadership the initial state or the leadership of Pakistan Muslim League gave to I mean, even under a constitutional framework, it was not very democratic. And I must say, and I don't know if you're this is blasphemous to say, but even under Jinnah, we first sort of got rid of Khoro's government in Sindh. Then we got rid of Khan Saab's government in what was then NWFP, right? And he would have gone after Mamdod as well, which Liaquat Ali Khan did. In all these three places, Balochistan was yet not a state, a province. And in 1948, it was forcefully incorporated into Pakistan through a semi-military threat. So Balochistan was, right? So I'm just saying that there were also these centralization kind of processes and undemocratic processes of bringing in governor's rule right from the beginning, under various kinds of pretext of, corruption and the kind of language you hear today, these people are corrupt and they can't be trusted, or they have made money out of evacuee property in Mamdod's case. So I think there is both things. One is sort of the objective condition in Pakistan. Of course, the majority of the people were poor. The majority of the people were had needed resources for living, for education, for health. But the state itself was basically involved in other kinds of intrigues and, like you said, perhaps consolidating their own privileges rather than thinking of the poor and the the underprivileged, right? So I'll leave it there. It's not a clear-cut answer, but because I don't think that revolutions happen just because of the conditions there. There also has to be an organized group of people to lead them. And I don't think that was, even with the nascent Communist Party, we didn't have, although they were aspiring to it, they didn't have that kind of leadership yet in place. And there are reasons, we can talk about it.
So, Kamran Saab, I know you have a very large body of work focusing on the left in India. But we do see that, if you see later politics in the subcontinent, India became, during the Cold War, became part of the Soviet bloc, and there were leftist socialist tendencies in India. And Pakistan during Ayub Khan's era, of course, I'll take you to the 60s now, we were more sort of tilted towards centralized economic planning, those 5-year plans that started in 1955. And, during the 60s, we were perhaps, I think, growing at an average annual growth rate of more than 6%, especially in that period between 1960 and 1965. We had phenomenal growth rates.
Absolutely.
And so that was centralized economic planning, and of course those planning institutions are also being set up, PAID and the Planning Commission, which were at the forefront of Pakistan's planning. And so Pakistan was all poised for centralized economic planning for more times to come. But then we saw sort of an implicit discontinuation of these 5-year economic plans during Bhutto's era, but Bhutto nationalized the industries. So if you see this overall sort of bent towards leftism and socialism during the 60s and perhaps even in the early 70s, do you think that this was like a sort of a regional inclination that Pakistan was also part of, or were Pakistan's circumstances peculiar that led it towards centralized economic planning in the 60s?
Yeah, Asisab, thank you. I mean, your training in economics, you would know these things better, but there's several factors, right? I mean, historically, of course, Pakistan tilted. I mean, the Indian communist or socialist experiment is very different. In 1958, already the Communist Party of India wins election in Kerala.
Yeah.
And so already Namrudipad is there, and there is a certain kind of coexistence with Nehru because of his own sort of broader socialistic tendencies and investment, state investment in education and in health and in various kinds of giving subsidies to various kinds of social sectors. But leaving India aside, that's a different issue. In Pakistan, of course, from the early 50s, tilts towards a more sort of a coalition with the United States in the evolving Cold War with CENTO and CETO and all those kinds of things. And by Ayub Khan coming in, one of the things that growth also manages is that very early in 58 and 59, General Burki was, I think, the health and labor minister. Under him, they already have very sort of labor had to be controlled. There was a lot of labor. I mean, 50s history, we can go in, every day there was a government change and all kinds of ways in which people were asking for democratic change. And eventually, Skandar Mirza has this kind of coup. And then within a few days, Ayub Khan comes into power, removing Skandar Mirza as well. And no elections happen, because that was the anticipation that after 1956, there will constitution, there'll be an election and a popular election. And everyone says we would have won. Who knows who would have won? But the point is, but labor had to be controlled. So what happens is a very draconian sort of push towards labor. And within that, of course, there is space of state capital, actually. PIDC is formed already in 58, 52, 53. And a lot of big names of your industrial captains of the era were given a seat on that forum. And basically, a lot of industrialization happens in the 50s and in the 60s is through state investment, right? I mean, basically, the state comes in, of course, and also with very, you talk absolutely from 60s and 65, I mean, the Papineck basically talks about this notion as the robber barons, because the argument that Mehboob Haq, who later on becomes a progressive economist, is basically trickle down, right? If we have industrialization, people will be employed. We control labor. We put in funds, we have a liberal monetary policy, and international funds come in. It's basically the World Bank support. What happens in 65 is 65 war happens, which is, mistake or not, and the World Bank money dries up. And then we have floods in 66, 67. And that's where the sputtering of the miracle starts happening. And by 67, 68, you talked about PIDE's journal, Pakistan Development Review. There's a 67 or 68 article, which really shows that the decade that is shown as this really growth thing and industrialization and the productivity and the participation of labor in the formal working in people in the formal working force. But the discrepancy between haves and have-nots, the sort of gap between the rich and poor also increases, right? That's why this whole argument that Bhutto makes about the, the 20 families and this and that. So I think already economists in places like that you have mentioned that are creation of this growth are looking at that. And by 68, 69, it's very clear that development miracle did not have a much the kind of trickle down or the kind of egalitarian spread or the kind of raising poverty levels. It didn't have that kind of effect. The concentration of wealth remained at a certain point. I mean, these are also, that's why in the late 60s, you have people like Bhutto playing or flirting with the idea of socialism, right? Because then we are talking about musawat and egalitarianisms and things like that. Even the right is talking about that, because you couldn't do it you couldn't have a popular mass-based movement without addressing some of the inequities that the system had produced in the 60s.